September 1884. The train from Omaha slowed at Cheyenne Springs, exactly the way it always slowed on that long prairie curve, and Eliza Calder pressed the folded marriage letter to her chest and counted, for the last time, the reasons a sensible woman crossed 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never once laid eyes on. She had a letter in his hand, a thin gold locket he had mailed her, and a promise written in ink that a home and a name were waiting at the end of the line. And what she did not yet know, what no one on that platform had the heart to tell her until she had already stepped down into the dust, was that the man who had made every one of those promises had been 3 weeks in the ground. She came west to be a bride. She would leave the depot platform a widow who had never once been a wife. Eliza was 26, slight and straight-backed, with chestnut hair she had braided over one shoulder before dawn, so she would look settled and capable when her husband first saw her. She had eaten on a stranger's charity for 3 days of the journey. She had sold her mother's sewing machine to buy the ticket. She had read Caleb Harlan's letters so many times that the creases had gone soft as cloth, and she had decided, somewhere across the brown middle of Nebraska, that a man who wrote the way he wrote, plain and kind, and a little afraid of saying too much, was a man she could learn to love. The locket at her throat. Hell's likeness, or so she believed. She had not yet opened it. She had been saving that, foolishly, for the moment they met. The platform was empty of grooms. A porter set her oxblood valise down beside her and would not meet her eyes. Down the boardwalk, 3 people had stopped to watch, a stout man in a grocer's apron, a thin man in shirt sleeves, and a church wife in a stiff bonnet. And Eliza heard the church wife say, not quite under her breath, "That'll be the Harlan girl. Came all this way for a dead man. Somebody ought put her back on the train before she shames herself." That was Hetty Brant, though Eliza did not know the name yet. The grocer was Joss Pinder, and the thin man was Marl Dooley, and between the 3 of them they ran the talk of Cheyenne Springs the way the river ran the bottom land, slow and certain and everywhere. By nightfall the whole town would have decided what a jilted mail-order bride was worth, and the number they settled on was nothing at all. Eliza did not move. She had learned in a hard life that the worst thing a person could do when the ground opened was to flinch where everyone could see. So she stood with the letter against her ribs and the locket cold at her throat, and she waited, because waiting was the only dignity she had left to spend. And then a man stepped out of the depot's shadow into the gold of the late sun and took off his hat. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with a short dark beard and tired gray-blue eyes, and on the left sleeve of his dusty range coat he wore a black mourning band. He turned the one worn hat in his hands the way men do when they have rehearsed a thing and still cannot find the front door of it. "Ma'am," he said, "you'll be Miss Calder." It was not a question. "I'm Wade Harlan. Caleb was my brother." "Was," she repeated. Just the one word. 3 weeks Tuesday, Wade said. "His lungs." "The doctor came up from Laramie, but there wasn't a thing in his bag for it. He asked after you at the end. He'd had your letter saying which train." He stopped. The next part cost him something. "I'd have written to turn you back, but he never told me where to send it. I only had what was in the desk, and that was all reaching the other way, toward you." Eliza looked at this stranger in his dead brother's grief and found she had no tears to give him, only a terrible, practical clarity. "Then I have come a very long way," she said, "to be nobody's wife in a town that has already decided I am a fool." "No," Wade said. And here was the thing the gossips on the boardwalk could not have predicted. The thing that turned the whole story on its hinge. He settled the hat back on his head, slow, like a man taking up a load. "My brother gave you his word, a home and a name. He wrote it and he signed it and he meant it. And a Harlan does not break a promise just because the man who made it has died." He met her eyes. "The promise didn't die with him, Miss Calder. It just changed hands. If you have ever watched the world write someone off in a single glance, the plain one, the bought one, the one the room decided wasn't worth the trouble, and felt some stubborn part of you root for them to be proven worthy. After all, then you already belong here, and you should take a second to subscribe, because the overlooked person turning out to be the one worth choosing is the only kind of love story this channel tells. Stay with me. Eliza and Wade are only at the beginning of theirs, and the part that matters has not happened yet. The homestead sat 4 miles north, a clapboard cabin, and a sagging barn on a quarter section of grass that Caleb had broken with his own hands. Wade drove her out in the wagon without another word, and the first thing she saw when they crested the rise was the grave, a raw pine marker on a low knoll, the earth still mounded and dark. He stopped the team. "I'll take you wherever you want to go," he said. "Back to the depot, to the boarding house in town. I'll pay your passage home if that's your wish. I owe my brother that much." He looked out at the marker. "Or you can stay. The claim's half yours by the letter," he wrote, "whether the law's caught up to it or not. But I won't have you bound to a dead man's word against your will. That's not honoring it. That's just chains with his name on them." Eliza got down from the wagon. She walked to the marker and stood over it a while. This man she had crossed a continent to marry and would never meet. And she found she was not angry at him. He had tried to give her a life. Death had simply gotten to the post ahead of her train. She took the folded letter from where it lived against her heart and read it once more. The soft, creased paper, the plain and frightened kindness of it, and she understood that the man who wrote it would have hated for it to come to nothing. "I'll stay," she said. "Through the winter at least, long enough to decide. I didn't sell my mother's machine to run home the first hard day." Wade nodded once, as if she'd passed a test he hadn't meant to set. "Then we'd best make it lawful," he said, "before the town makes it ugly." They were married 3 days later by Reverend Amos Teague, the circuit preacher standing at the graveside with the fresh marker between them. A proxy vow, the old man called it, binding her to the claim and the name the way Caleb's letter had promised, with Wade standing in for the brother who could not. It was the strangest wedding the Reverend had performed in 40 years on the trail, and he wept a little doing it, though Eliza and Wade did not. They shook hands afterward like two people closing a sensible bargain. There was a foot of dust and silence between them, and neither one reached across it. That was how the marriage began, not with love, with a promise kept by the wrong brother over the grave of the right one. The town gave them 3 weeks before the talk turned mean. Hetty Brant told the church sewing circle that a woman who'd marry one brother's corpse and another brother's pity would not last a Wyoming winter, and the name she coined. The widow, who was never a wife, went round Cheyenne Springs and stuck like a burr. Joss Pinder shorted Eliza's flour and charged her full price and dared her with his eyes to say a word about it. Marl Dooley took bets at the saloon, and the odds were long against her staying past the first snow. So Eliza did the only thing she knew how to do with contempt. She outworked it. She had grown up poor on a hardscrabble farm, and her hands knew labor, even if this country was strange to them. She learned the woodpile and the well and the temperamental stove. She mended the barn's broken stalls and patched the chicken run and turned the kitchen garden over before the ground hardened. She rose before light and worked past dark, and where the other homestead wives in the valley would not call on her, she made the cabin a place worth coming home to anyway. Scrubbed, mended, the smell of bread in it. She kept the letter in her apron pocket where she could feel it against her hip, and whenever the town's verdict reached her, in a shorted sack of flour, in a turned shoulder at the mercantile, in a child hushed and pulled across the street, she would press 2 fingers to the locket at her throat, and the 2 small objects, the promise and the likeness, became the spine that held her upright. A person can carry a great deal of cruelty, she was learning, so long as they are carrying it toward something. She was carrying it toward a home, and she had decided the town did not get a vote in whether she deserved one. Wade watched her work and said little, but the little he said began to matter. He showed her how to read the sky for weather. He left the better cuts of meat on her side of the table without comment. When she split her palm open on the axe, he cleaned it and bound it with a gentleness that did not match his size, and she caught herself studying the tired kindness in his gray-blue eyes and looking quickly away. He still wore the mourning band. He still slept in the barn loft and left her the cabin every night without being asked. A decade he'd been alone out here, the Reverend had told her, too proud or too quiet to write for a wife of his own, the kind of man who would honor a dead brother's promise but never claim a living gift. The cabin had a cold end and a warm end, and slowly, week by week, the two of them stopped sitting at opposite ends of it. She did not mean to start loving him. It came the way weather comes on the high plains, no cloud, no warning, and then the whole sky changed. It was on a gray afternoon in late November, with the first real snow threatening, that Eliza finally opened the locket. She had been saving it all this time for a husband she would never have, and it seemed suddenly foolish to keep a dead man's face shut up in gold she wore every day. She sat by the window in the failing light and worked the small clasp with her thumbnail, and the locket sprang open. And there was Caleb's likeness, a young man with Wade's same grave eyes, and behind the tintype, folded so small it was nearly nothing, a slip of paper she had never known was there. If you have made it this far into Eliza's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She unfolded it with shaking fingers. It was Caleb's hand, but smaller, hurried, the writing of a man running out of breath, and it was not addressed to her. Wade, it read. By the time she opens this, I'll be gone, and you'll have done the stubborn thing and kept my word, because that's the only language you've ever let yourself answer to. So hear me out, brother. I didn't write for a wife for me. The doctor told me in the spring what my lungs were doing, and I had time to think on what I'd leave behind, and what I'd leave behind was you, alone on this grass, too proud to ask anyone for a thing, growing old in that loft with nobody. You'd never write for a woman yourself. You'd call it a weakness, but you'd cross fire to keep a promise. So I made you a promise to keep. Her name is Eliza. She's kind, and she's got more spine than this whole county. And the two of you are the only two people I know lonely enough and good enough to save each other. I'm sorry to do it from the grave. It was the only way you'd let me. Marry her for real, Wade. Not for my word. For your own sake. That's the last thing your brother ever asked. Eliza sat with the slip of paper in her lap and the locket open in her hand and understood, all at once, every cold and dutiful mile of the months behind her. The letter she had crossed a continent believing was Caleb's proposal had never been a proposal at all. It had been Caleb's matchmaking, a dying man arranging with the only leverage he had left for the two loneliest people he knew to find each other. Wade was not the substitute groom. He had been the intended one from the first. The vow he had kept out of duty was the thing his brother had built out of love. She did not tell him that night. She did not have the words. She folded the slip back behind the likeness and closed the locket, and lay awake listening to the wind come up, and somewhere past midnight the wind became a blizzard. And the blizzard became the test that would decide everything. It came down out of the north with the suddenness of every bad storm that country had ever thrown. No warning the eye could trust, the temperature falling so fast, the nails in the walls cracked like pistol shots. By dawn the snow was driving sideways in white threads through every seam of the cabin, and the cattle, Caleb's small herd, that was the whole future of the claim, had drifted with the storm and bunched against the far fence where they would smother in the drifts and freeze before noon. Wade was already pulling on his coat when Eliza came down. "Stay in," he said. "I'll bring what I can." But 20 head was more than one man could move in that wind, and they both knew it. And she had not sold her mother's machine to sit by the stove while the claim died in the cold. She took the folded letter and the locket from the table and tucked them both inside her coat, against her heart, the way a soldier carries the thing he means to die holding. Then she pulled on the heavy charcoal coat and the knit scarf and went out into the white after her husband. It was the hardest 4 hours of her life. The cold was a physical force with the direction, shoving at her chest, packing the breath back down her throat. They worked the herd a few head at a time, Wade breaking trail with a coil of rope and Eliza driving from behind, the two of them shouting words the wind tore away. And the only warmth in the whole white world was the press of that letter against her ribs, and the man ahead of her who would not quit because she would not quit. They got the last of the cattle into the barn as the light failed. Wade dragged the door shut against the storm and turned, snow crusted in his beard, and looked at her standing there, frosted and gasping and unbroken, and something in his tired eyes broke open at last. They thawed by the stove that night, close, her hands and his nearly touching, and she could not hold the secret anymore. She took the locket from inside her coat and opened it, and put Caleb's last slip of paper into Wade's hands and watched him read his brother's voice. By the orange stove light, she watched his jaw work. She watched a decade of careful loneliness come apart in a man too proud to have ever asked for what he wanted. When he finished, he did not speak for a long while. Then he said, "Lo, he always was a sly one. Even dying, he outthought me." And then, quieter still, "I didn't keep the promise for his sake, Eliza. Not after the first week. I have to tell you that. I kept it for mine." That was as near to a declaration as a man like Wade would ever come, and it was enough. It was more than enough. But a frontier claim is not saved by love alone, and the cold was not the last enemy. The thaw brought Silas Renton. He came up the lane on a tall black horse, in a black frock coat and a string tie, silver-haired and courteous and cold as a banker's handshake, with a rolled survey map under his arm and a smile that never once reached his pale eyes. Renton was the cattle king of that country. He had been circling Caleb's claim for the water on it since before Caleb took sick, and a dead man and a jilted bride had looked to him like easy grass. He spread his map on the pine table and explained kindly that there was a flaw in the Harlan title, that Caleb's patent had never been perfected, that with Caleb dead the claim reverted, that a proxy marriage to a corpse's promise would not hold 10 minutes in a territorial court, and that he was prepared to be generous and fight them out before the law turned them off it with nothing. He set a number on the table. It was an insult dressed as mercy. Eliza did not reach for the number. She reached into her apron pocket and laid Caleb's marriage letter on the table beside Renton's map, the plain, sign-dated promise of a home and a name, witnessed in Caleb's own hand, and now lawful through the vow Reverend Teague had recorded in the county book. "My husband's brother promised me this claim in writing," she said, "and I married into it before God and the territory, with the preacher's record to prove the day. Half of it is mine by his word, and the other half is my husband's by blood. You are welcome to take that to any court you like, Mr. Renton. I have crossed 2,000 miles in one Wyoming winter to keep this paper good. I do not think a judge will be moved by a man who waited for a funeral to make his offer." Renton's smile finally failed. He looked from the steady hazel-green eyes to the worn letter to the big silent brother, standing in the doorway with a coil of rope in his hands. And he understood that the easy grass had teeth. He rolled his map slow, the way a man does when he is trying to look unbothered and is fooling no one. He did not raise his number, and he did not threaten, because Silas Renton was a coward in a good coat, and cowards know to the minute when the table has turned. "You'll regret turning down a fair price," he said, "because men like him always need the last word." "No," Eliza answered, and she opened the door for him herself. "I think I'll regret almost nothing, Mr. Renton. I've found that out this winter." He rode out, and he did not come back, and that was the last the claim ever saw of him. By the time the snow was gone from the north shadows, the town had begun to change its mind about the widow who was never a wife. They had watched her hold a claim through a killing winter that Marl Dooley's odds swore she'd run from. They had heard how she faced down Renton with nothing but a letter and a level voice. Joss Pinder, who had shorted her flour all winter, weighed her order full and a little over, and would not look at her while he did it. And Hetty Brant, passing Eliza on the boardwalk one bright morning, stopped and gave her a small, stiff, grudging nod, woman to woman, which from Hetty Brant was the same as a public apology. They were married for real that spring in the homestead yard, with the wild flowers up and the fence standing and the claim green and saved around them. Reverend Amos Teague performed this one too. And this time he was not the only one who wept, and this time there was no foot of dust between them, and this time, before the old man spoke the words, Wade Harlan reached up and untied the black mourning band from his sleeve and folded it away, not because he had stopped grieving his brother, but because his brother had not sent him a wife to mourn. He had sent him one to live for. Eliza pinned a sprig of prairie bloom into her braid and held the folded letter to her chest as she had held it on the empty platform a lifetime ago, and the thin gold locket caught the morning sun at her throat. And she thought of Caleb, who had reached out of the grave to give the two loneliest people he knew the one thing neither of them would ever have asked for. That night, she laid the letter and the open locket side by side on the pine table in the lamplight, and across the soft, creased paper she set their 2 plain wedding bands. And for a long moment, the promise and the likeness and the rings lay together in the warm light like the closing of a circle that had taken a death and a journey and a whole hard winter to draw. She had come west to marry a man who had already died. His brother had honored the promise anyway. And somewhere in the keeping of it, the marriage neither of them had wanted had become the one they had been meant for all along. If this story stayed with you, sit with it a moment. And ask yourself, honestly, if you had been Eliza on that empty platform, with the letter cold against your heart, and the whole town deciding you were a fool, would you have climbed back onto the train and gone home to the life you knew, or would you have stayed and let a stranger's promise become your own? I do not think there is a wrong answer. I only think the ones who stay are the ones who find out what they were worth. And if you want another story about an overlooked heart proven worthy on the far edge of the frontier, there's one waiting for you right here.